giving you a bit of a primer in terms of, hey, here's how the brain is changing in response to these very indirect dynamics that are actually hitting us, affecting the therapist as well. These changes are things that are truly brain changes. So they're structural changes that are happening in the brain. And these structural changes then give rise to certain symptoms that are really associated with that zone 3. So where we're going now is, how do you recognize the subtle changes early enough so that we can really deal with those effectively before they get very progressed and then it just becomes obvious to everybody? So I titled this Signs of Brain Damage because it's truly brain damage. It is changes in your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, those two areas of the brain. The connections are severed. Therefore, we say the brain volume decreases. That's the brain damage that happens with chronic stress, which produces cortisol, the stress hormone that stays in the system too long and causes those severed connections. So if you want to get a sense for zone 3, there are 8 symptoms that I'm going to go through on this. And these are just 8 symptoms that I have learned to look at to catch things very early, because I work in some very difficult trauma environments internationally as well as locally. And so by the time I get there, I am dealing with staff and people who are care providers who've been working in these contexts for years, maybe even living in it for their whole life. And they figured out how to do it, but sometimes they have their moments, and I'm trying to catch, okay, when you tip into the red zone, can we catch it and enact some special procedures so that we can get you out of it. So these look like you would recognize this if it happened in you or your therapist, but I'm gonna be real honest with you. But if it were that easy, there'd be no need for this talk. I'm gonna tell you, here's what you probably wanna be trained to look for. When we're talking about those initial symptoms in zone 3, short temper, anxiousness, depression, okay, but I'm gonna focus in on the anxiousness. Now, before people feel anxious, before you feel anxious, typically your cortisol elevation is up. In order to even be in this state, you've got elevated cortisol because you've got too much on your plate, too many responsibilities, or you're just beyond your capacity. When that happens, cortisol's job is to wake you up in the morning. In addition to mobilizing your body for fight flight when you encounter big stressors, this is what wakes you up each morning. So while you sleep, your cortisol level rises steadily so that by 7 a.m., if the alarm doesn't wake you up, it does. It falls then over the course of the day. When it falls continuously for about 12 hours till about 7 p.m., where it's at its natural low point, the baseline. And if you go to sleep somewhere before 10:30, 11 p.m., the cortisol is just naturally at a low point so that your body shuts down. You get restorative sleep, everything is great. But while you sleep, it's rising because it's going to wake you up at 7 a.m. if the alarm doesn't. So it's this 12-hour cycle where it falls or rises. It's on this daily rhythm pattern. So if you also know that cortisol gets bumped up, if you experience an increase in cortisol whenever you encounter any sort of a demand, big or small, then what we can look for is, as that is supposed to be falling over the course of the day so that at night you can go to sleep, it doesn't actually fall in the same way. It sort of rises in response to the chronic stressors that you're dealing with. So that by baseline, time to go to bed, the cortisol is not low. It's a little bit elevated. But because it interferes with sleep, then you cannot fall asleep as fast as you normally do. If it takes you longer than 25 minutes, 30 minutes to fall asleep, 9 times out of 10, it's because your cortisol has been elevated. That means over the course of your day, you've got chronic stressors that may not have ruined your day or even made your radar, that has caused your body to be in this response mode. And as a result of that, you haven't gotten rid of that cortisol. It's keeping you awake. And so we call it early insomnia. It takes you longer than 20 minutes to fall asleep at night. That's what you want to be attuned to in yourself, particularly, because if you can catch it there, you can do a lot with that. It is very easy to then undo that symptom if that is the one symptom that you have. First sign that you've crossed over into that working beyond your capacity zone is that elevated cortisol, and you may see it in your sleep pattern in terms of early insomnia. We can get that back within a day. We can get you back in the zone 2. Now, if it continues, we start to see then the short temper part. You are prone to conflict and you start to withdraw from people, or both. When I say short temper, what it means is the things that you normally tolerate, which are annoying, frustrating. When your tolerance shrinks, those things you find incredibly frustrating and annoying. It's more intense. And so what people will do is they will then either withdraw from people who are triggering those things, or if they can't withdraw, they just get into conflict with them because their tolerance for things that do normally annoy them, now it just really angers them. And that's what's driving that. And typically you would think, yeah, well, if that's a symptom, I would know that if I was in that space. Not necessarily. And why is because we never make sense of that symptom as my tolerance has shrunk and I'm getting really annoyed at things that normally I wouldn't. That is not how we make sense of it. We typically think, why is that person getting so much more annoying today? Why is this job so much worse? Or why is it getting worse? We externalize that thing. This is why the very, very practical knowledge of this is, please don't make life-altering decisions when you have this symptom, because they are emotionally reactive decisions. They're driven by that amygdala. You will make a decision to end a relationship, to quit a job, on the false idea that the person who you're with is actually getting worse, or the job that you have is actually getting worse. And to be real honest, the job and the person are not getting worse. They're the same that they always were. You are changing, and you're no longer tolerating those things in those people or in that job in the same way. So, I kind of go humorous with it when I say, now you're just experiencing your partner the way that your best friends warned you about before you got with this person, okay? But you were in love, right? So now you're seeing what they saw. And that's not the time to leave the relationship, though. That's the time to get out of that symptom, do what you need to do to get back into zone 2. Then you make the best decisions, because you don't want to forget you're seeing some things now that are real things. So you don't want to be complacent with it if it really needs to be actionable. So you make your better decisions from zone 2, but you got to get out of zone 3 in order to do that, or else it's just going to be emotionally reactive, which means you leave a relationship, you quit a job, and then your tolerance returns to normal. And you think, what have I done? Now I've got regret because I left something that really wasn't as bad as I felt it to be at the time. It was just that I was highly stressed. That's always hindsight. So that's what that experience is like. Feeling of no room inside, everything affects us, no shock absorbers. So when the hippocampus is impacted by stress hormones and we have the brain change, the hippocampus is what shuts off unnecessary emotional reactions. Not a cause for alarm, shut it off. That's what it does. Well, when it can't shut things off, that means everything is affecting you. And so here's an example that truly people report. They start to have emotional reactions to things that, you wouldn't normally have the emotional reactions to. So here's the concrete example. If you sit and you watch a movie and it causes you to cry at the sad parts, and laugh at the happy parts and get angry at the angry parts, if you go through all those emotions over the course of a, 1.5 hour movie, the movie's not real. It's a story, it's fiction, or what have you. But that's a good movie. That is why a movie gets an Oscar, because it takes us on that journey and it can fool the hippocampus that says, this is not real, this is not me, but it takes you on that ride as though you're a part of it. That's a good movie, right? That's supposed to happen. It's designed to get around your hippocampus, to trick it so you can have this experience. But a commercial should not do that. And when people have this impairment going on in their brain, because the brain is now damaged, the commercials are eliciting these types of reactions. Not the commercials with the animals in the shelters that are designed to elicit the emotions. I'm talking about the Tide commercial, the cereal commercial. You're seeing the cute family on the commercial. You're seeing, the kids out playing, and it's like, oh my goodness, remember we could do that and tears are coming. That is not normal. All right, that's not normal for most of us, put it that way. And when you're experiencing things that are outside of your normal in response to these everyday things, you do feel like you're out of control of your emotions. And this is the sign that we're talking about. So when you start to avoid things like, television, not because you're trying to avoid the news, which absolutely can be, angering and shocking and all of that, but you're just avoiding anything that is going to trigger emotion, because everything is triggering your emotions. That's what this symptom is. So Hopefully that makes sense in terms of what that then looks like in real life. Being unable to think well is the next one. Everything's important, nothing's important. So your hippocampus, as well as the prefrontal cortex, it helps you to prioritize what is the important thing to do when you respond to any demand or crisis or situation. What do you do first? What's going to be most helpful? That's an automatic ordering process of the brain. Well, if those parts of the brain are impacted in that way, it cannot do that naturally. So it's really easy to see in other people, because when there is the crisis, it's COVID-19, and you have colleagues, and some of your colleagues respond in ways that are so not helpful to anything that is needing to be addressed. And a lot of times we think that colleague is out to lunch, or they're doing that stuff on purpose just to get on our nerves. And that's really more of a sign of our own short temper and our tolerance shrinking. But really what's going on is the person can't tell that they're responding in ways that are not helpful. It's their brain is not processing things in an efficient way to prioritize what is the thing to do in order to be helpful. And so they rearrange the deck chairs of the Titanic. If you know what that is a reference to, hey, the ship is sinking. We've got a major catastrophe happening here. We need to be getting everybody in the lifeboats, but instead some people are adjusting the deck chairs, making the furniture look nice. No, but that's a sign that there's something going on with them in terms of the zone that they're in. Their brain is not quite processing things efficiently to deal with problems. So if it's you, though, because you don't realize when you're doing this, here's how you can get a sense for where you are with it. Questions like, what do you want to eat for dinner tonight? What do you want to do this weekend? What do you want to watch this evening on TV? Typically, those are simple questions that do not hang people up. But when you find that you've got such a level of indecisiveness when it comes to everyday routine things, that is a sign that your brain prioritization is not quite working with you. These are not questions that should elicit, minutes of deliberation internally. This is things that, of course I know what I want to eat. Of course I know what I prefer to watch. That's how it should roll. But when you find that you're really hung up, you're on the fence with just everyday things like that, that's what this feels like when you look at it and apply it to yourself. People really do feel like their decisive selves are no longer functionable, and they feel like, it's a real strange feeling to experience indecisiveness for somebody who is actually quite decisive normally. So, don't underestimate that. That's really a stressor. All right, the next one is not actually a sign of brain damage or change. I throw it in here in order to get on the soapbox a little bit, to bring things into perspective, and to apply it to this COVID-19 context. Some of us engage in instant gratification coping at the wrong times. Alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and sex, what they all have in common: you engage them, you feel better very quickly. Instant gratification. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot engage with sexual activity. I'm not saying that you can't drink wine. You probably do hear me saying don't, do crystal meth. You do hear me say that. But, instant gratification is such a hook, because under seasons of high stress and demand, like we're in currently with COVID-19, the most constructive coping strategies are never instant gratification. It typically means you've got to engage a process directly, bring it up. It's going to feel worse before it gets better. There's no quick fixes. You've got to be able to sort of hang and navigate with some things, while it might actually, you got to look at the ugly underside of things in order to address it. So the experience can actually feel worse before you move it into better. That's just how therapy works. You're going to bring up tough stuff. You're probably going to experience some tears and some stress and anxiety, but you know what? We're going to move through this constructively. That is a constructive coping response. It may feel a little worse before it gets better, but it's constructive, so it does get better. These just make people feel better quickly. No getting worse, you just feel better. And why it's such a hook during a season like this is because you're always training your brain for how it responds to high stress moments. If in high stress, you go for instant gratification, then tomorrow when it experiences high stress, when the brain is in a high stress mode, it's going to gravitate towards instant gratification. That is how habits are formed. And so I'll just say it this way. This is a time where when you used to drive to work, but now you're working from home, what you don't have is you don't have a transition period. So when work is done, instead of getting in a car and having 30 minutes or an hour to sort of get into a better headspace, you know, pray the day away, breathe, whatever that is, you don't have that anymore. Now you just shut a laptop and you become insta mom, insta dad, insta partner, whatever is next. You just sort of jump right into it. How do you shift out of that mode, you know, when you don't have that transition? Well, you can drink some wine. You can do the virtual happy hour. You can engage something that has an instant gratification channel change. And that's a hook, okay? Don't go for that, because you're setting up a learning paradigm so that as this COVID thing drags on into months, that's going to become the place where your brain's going to want to go in terms of how it copes. And that's how problems are developed. And I always say it this way: therapists lose their licenses all the time for sleeping with their clients and with the family members of their clients. And it's not for lack of knowledge. They know that this is not right. It's that they don't understand the dynamics involved when you start to get engaged in instant gratification coping, when sexuality becomes the way that you deal with your stress. And then you have a partner that can't keep up with that appetite because your work environment is so stressful. But in your work environment, you have transference reactions where your clients and the family members of your clients see you as so wonderful, they just want you in any kind of way. And that becomes very seductive, and people go for it all the time. It's a slippery slope based on instant gratification coping that sets that up. And I'm saying, hey, take this very seriously. These are not the seasons to actually gravitate towards these things. These are the seasons where you engage the healthy coping strategies as best as possible. Put in those transition times, even if it means shutting the laptop and taking a walk around your block. You know, that's a transition time then. That helps you then shift out. So you want to think about it in those ways. Some of us then will have, back to the actual symptoms in zone 3, have intrusive thoughts. Because if you have a flashback, that's like zone 4. You know that you're reliving a trauma. But zone 3 stuff, where it's hard to see, intrusive thoughts is what most of us encounter. And that's when you will find that you cannot get the same amount of work done over the course of a day that you're accustomed to doing. That's where you sort of see it. What's really going on in the process? Well, as you're doing the task and handling the business of the day, there's so much on your plate that your brain is trying to resolve and solve all those things. So it wanders to those unresolved things. And so you find that you're wrestling your thoughts and your concentration back to the task at hand. And too much of your day becomes that wrestling, trying to get your focus back on the task at hand. So not doing the task, trying to get your focus back because it's wandering to so many other things that you got to do. And so that means less productivity at the end of your day, because that's where your energy is going. And so that's what we mean by intrusive thoughts. Too much stuff, you're beyond your capacity, and that's what you start to see. So look for when you start to feel and experience less productivity, what you accomplish over the course of the day takes you longer to do it, or you're just not able to maintain it. That's a sign that you're beyond that capacity mark in your zone 3. Feeling mistrustful and paranoid. This is the 7th one. I'll be honest, I'm a little pressed to sort of identify this in zone 3. I see this in zone 4 probably more often. It's not bizarre paranoia. That you know, you don't need medication to deal with this. What this is you start to misperceive the intentions of the people around you as somehow being negative towards you or preventing you from getting ahead or doing your job or what have you. You start to misperceive the intentions of the people who should be on your team as somehow undermining you. And it's easy to see in other people. This is when, as a consultant, when I go into an agency, I know when I've got these people in the room, because these are the folks who think that I've been brought there by the boss to get them in line. And I can feel the vibe coming from them because it's fighting already. Or it's the people who, no matter what the discussion is in an all-staff meeting, they're going to hijack the discussion to beat their particular drum of their issue. And it's going to sound like a polemic. There's no solution. They just are complaining. And they're going to take any topic to figure out how they can introduce this. You know, that is this symptom, okay? And you never, me as a consultant at least, never want to open up a group discussion when I've got this person in the room or too many people in this with this symptom, because it's just going to hijack it. I need to get them out of this mode so that they can actually participate in a constructive way. And there's a way to get people out of this mode that we'll get into. So just know that that's what that symptom is. All right. I see the comments coming in, transition period. Very, very good. Some people have figured that out intuitively. The last one is memory problems. And this is a really common one. So memory problems, your hippocampus, part of that brain that can be impacted. It is responsible for laying down your memories. When it is not able to function, then you start to have problems with your memory. Not long-term memory. Things that are already in memory, you're good. If you forget your name and where you live, that's a stroke. That's a real problem. I'm talking about when you forget short-term memory things. Things like, hey, where did you put the keys? Where did you put the report that you were just working on? When you're looking for your glasses, they're in your hand, but you're still looking for them because you don't know where they are. It's that sort of thing. When you have too many of these symptoms that show up, that's telling the person that, number one, your brain's not working with you automatically in the way that it used to. So it's having these lapses. That's directly the reason why you see the lapses in zone 3, or at least other people see those lapses and you don't. Those lapses are happening. It's short-term memory problems that are actually showing up because the hippocampus cannot actually do its job in just giving you memories. And so that is what's showing up. And people typically don't recognize it as, oh, I'm in zone 3. They typically go to the extreme with it. Oh my goodness, my brain, maybe I have Alzheimer's. Maybe this is the beginning of early Alzheimer's. It's the long fade. And I'm being funny with it, but honestly, this is what people feel. They start to worry about, am I becoming demented? Am I actually developing Alzheimer's? 9 times out of 10, if you just get out of zone 3, everything comes back and your brain is working with you again. This is really easy to treat, really easy to get you out of this season. So those are the 8 symptoms. Now, here's what I would recommend. If you think about the optimal zone, zone 2, where we're trying to keep everybody, if you've got none of these symptoms over the past 2 months since COVID-19 kicked in, you're in zone 2. And if you're in zone 2 with none of these symptoms over the past 2 months, you need to write a book on how you maintain that through a COVID-19 crisis, because you will sell 1 million copies. But most of us do find that we have 1 or 2 or some of these symptoms going on, and that places us in zone 3. It just means we are actually beyond our natural capacity that we've cultivated. So we are likely to see memory lapses come up that we notice. We're likely to see that it's a little bit more difficult for us to get to sleep. If you've got 1 or 2 symptoms, you just crossed into this zone. If you've got, 2, 3 of these symptoms, you're pretty square in zone 3. Now, if you've got 4 or 5 of these symptoms, you're now entering zone 4. If you've got 6, 7, 8, if you've got that many of these symptoms, you are actually a detriment to the people around you. Anything that you put your hand to, you're just going to mess up and make worse. This is why I say there's no situation that is so bad that it cannot be made worse. Recognize when you are bringing to the table the things that make bad situations worse. One of them is a brain that cannot function well. And this is what that is, 6, 7, or 8 of these symptoms. You need to get out of these symptoms so that when you bring your best effort to dealing with the issue and navigating the context, it is constructive. So if you're freaked out by that, hang on. We can get you out of it. Trust me. I work in these really intense environments and we can get people out of this stuff. But you don't get out overnight. Okay, it does take a real conscious effort to change some of your routines, because it's not about the panacea, do one thing and you're out. It's about how you are living and doing life. Change that pattern, and that's what gets you out of it. It does take a couple months to get people out of this. So just know that that's where we're going with it. So here's the thing. If you've got no symptoms, great, wonderful, write the book. If you've got 1 or 2, please don't worry about it. We can get you out. That's real easy to deal with. Unless your 1 or 2 is that you actually smoke crack in order to detox from work. If you do heavy drugs, if you got crazy stuff like that, you just need to go to rehab. But if you've got 3 or 4, 5, hang on. We can help you with that. But the point is, be able to see this stuff, be able to see it in your therapist, help your therapist to be able to see it in themselves. Because if you can catch it early with 1 or 2, real easy to get people back, right? Real easy. If you don't catch it, it fuels the VT process. It fuels that process. So The more symptoms, now I was going to tell a joke, but I'm not, because sometimes it falls flat and I lose people with it. So here's what it was going to be, because I'm not going to leave you hanging. So there's a test that it's like a stress test, and it's really mirror images of two dolphins, mirror image, same dolphin, and the dolphin's jumping out of the water. And people with greater stress symptoms actually perceive more differences between identical images. They report they actually see more differences. And then I put the picture up, and it's supposed to get a laugh, which my intent is to normalize it for all of us. Everybody has some stress. We're in a season where we're all going to actually be experiencing this stuff. Don't worry about it. Hang on. We'll figure out what to do with it. I hesitate to tell the joke because I work in countries where my English and their English is a little different, and I can speak some of them, especially in Haiti, I can speak the language, but I'm not adept at the language. And so some people don't see this as a joke. And I can't clean it up. So that's why I'm just prefacing it, all right? So when you got these symptoms, it's going to show up in some ways that I think it's just really good to be able to have a lens for it within the supervision process and with supervisees and in yourself, in your work role. So VT and supervisees, what do supervisees need to see in order to catch this zone 3 stuff, to know what they're dealing with? Well, it's going to be those common stress responses, those 8 symptoms that I just said. They do need to know that. It's really helpful. Plus, trauma symptoms and adaptations. We're dealing with trauma dynamics, which means for VT, you can manifest real PTSD type symptoms, sequelae, not as intense as PTSD, so it's not going to cause the degree of impairment that a DSM diagnosis of PTSD implies, but they're going to be lesser in intensity. The lady who I talked about in the African context, she wasn't, having flashbacks of mutilation. It didn't happen to her, but she was having reactions to people who looked like me based on that's the image of the perpetrator. She's still dealing with me, but she's giving me such a crazy vibe that I don't really trust this lady. It's putting distance there. So you're seeing the same sorts of, intrusions, avoidance, hypervigilance, cognitive changes, but to a lesser degree, lesser intensity. They can still operate, but it does affect things. They do become unaware of their countertransference reactions, those things that will result in less therapeutic outcome over time. They just don't see it. Like I said, the person who says to the emoting client who is now putting words on their emotions behind the trauma, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, and they cause the client then to pull back in the process. They're unaware that they're doing that. So they don't see these dynamics. That's the key. They just don't see this. This is the water that they swim in. Sometimes I do see it with some therapists who they are not able to accept responsibility or apologize for their errors. They're so defended. they develop defenses. And so in the supervisory interaction, it's really, really hard to sort of get them to the place where you can constructively engage stuff. So here's an example. If you are a supervisor and you are female, and let's say your supervisee is male, and let's say he's male and older, and let's say he's reacting to some gender dynamics there based on just his frame, and he is doing things like when you're giving input, when you're trying to be collaborative, or when you're actually trying to be constructive and direct a bit, instead of saying, okay, yeah, and taking that in like most supervisees would, it's things like, well, I don't know, what so-and-so did it this way. Or, something that just gives you that sense that they're not open. That's the stuff, okay? And if you then go the extra mile and say, hey, there's something coming up where I kind of wonder, is there something going on with gender in our dynamic? I might present as much younger. If the supervisor is willing to wonder out loud and put that out on the table in the supervisory process, and what I've encountered with that, having been in that role many, many times, not around gender, but much more so around race, the supervisee doesn't say, oh, yes, that's it. The defenses kick in and they deny it. Okay. And so that's just a part of what happens when you're already dealing in, countertransference unawareness, because it's a self-unawareness, and so just know that can show up in these ways. It doesn't mean that you let it lie. It means you continue to wonder out loud when this stuff happens. And then after a while, it's pretty hard to dismiss, wow, this thing comes up regularly. It's easy to dismiss if it just comes up once. You know, oh yeah, maybe it was an off day. But when it's regular and you're consistent about bringing this to the table as a supervisor, you know, then it's something that's grist for the mill for the work. The opposite can be true. Some people have an overinflated sense of responsibility. Now that's when it comes to the work. So especially I've seen this with therapists who work with kids. They you know, these kids have been through, you know, all sorts of strains, stressors, and traumas. They've been abandoned and they're dealing with those issues. Well, when the therapist is done with their rotation or with their year, or they've got to somehow shift out of the caseload with this person, the therapist can feel like they're abandoning that client, because that client, that kid who can have those emotional triggers around abandonment, and they like the therapist, they like that relationship, that's tough for a therapist. That therapist is left with this image, this snapshot of this client in pain because abandonment was triggered. And they carry that with them when they now transition out, not realizing that, yeah, it's tough, but we can frame that in constructive ways. Kids bounce back, which means they will find another therapist who is a great person and they will help work through that. And the kid, you know, a month down the road, 2 months down the road, is now moving with the new therapeutic process. But the person in, we don't need a internal process magnifying that unnecessarily. But also don't lose sight that people carry strengths and they can figure out how to grow and move through things. And that is a part of what is entailed. When that gets off balance, we've got this dynamic. Okay, building walls to protect from future trauma. I'm just going to go through this because these are pretty intuitive and self-explanatory. You can have physiological manifestations of stress, illnesses, you know, it can predispose you for those things. Dysregulated nervous system. You can get hypertension, diabetes from ongoing chronic stressors, because elevated cortisol also depresses things like your ability to fight off infection, but it also puts certain stressors, stress hormones in the body that actually can result in the dysregulation of the system itself, the dysregulation of the, I'm blanking on my word, but whatever that system is that pumps out the stress hormones, it'll come to me. When that's off, then you get the dysregulation, and part of that is hypercortisolemia with all its symptoms. Part of that can be hypertension, and it can then lead to other things like diabetes down the road. And so it does have physical manifestations. So yes, our supervisees deal with these dynamics in these ways. Having a lens by which to understand them is really helpful. The risk factors for our supervisees, those who are likely to sort of encounter, have to deal with the VT negative manifestations a bit more, are those who really don't have quality supervision. And by quality supervision, there's a lot of research on this, and we need to go further. But, you know, quality supervision, initially we're talking about, do they have supervision? Do they have it enough? Enough contact points with a supervisor in order to meet the needs that that person is dealing with their client load? You know, and that's just going to vary depending on the client load and the demand and the person. It's going to vary. So you've got to meet the minimum for sure. But please know that sometimes you just need more touch points than that. Also, though, quality supervision, like I said earlier, being a good supervisor is not the same thing as being a good therapist. You know, there are definitely some skill sets that are unique to supervision. That a good therapist, great, but a good supervisor, different animal. And so being aware of what those things are, which we'll get into, is really key. When you got a high percentage of trauma survivors in the caseload, for obvious reasons, you know, that brings more of that exposure, indirect exposure to the trauma dynamic. And also little experience. So I know you're thinking with this, the new therapist who's come in as the trainee, and that's not actually what I mean on this, because that therapist probably knows that they're in over their head and they need to ask questions. I'm talking about the therapist who actually has some confidence of themselves as a therapist, but they haven't worked with your particular clientele before. They haven't worked with trauma cases. and then they transition, or they have more trauma cases that are now on their caseload and they're not accustomed to it. But, you know, they're licensed, they know how to do therapy. They may not think to ask about or seek supervisory input in the way that is really helpful. So they sort of go on their laurels and they get chewed up in this process. And these are other things: work or organizational mismatch, meaning you can just have people have a very different style and it's just not a good fit for the organization. And then the energy is drained because they're having to navigate the dissonance between how they naturally function and what this organization is asking of them. And they're not actually putting that towards the client work. Lack of professional support systems and inadequate orientation and training coming into the clinic. I'll say one thing about that. We assume that programs are equipping the therapists that they're sending to us as trainees. We assume that. Sometimes that's accurate. Sometimes that's not right. Sometimes you get some therapists, and that could be trainees, but it could also be people who just get hired who are licensed. They, for whatever reason, don't have the right preparation. Now, if the preparation is due to a lack of skills, maybe your organization or maybe you then make up that difference and figure out how you develop particular plans and strategies to develop and cultivate those skills. Maybe you put that investment there. Maybe you've got the cushion to do that. When it's really a difference in values or just a real lack of knowledge skills and maybe the values are different, that's a hiring error. Okay, now that's where I would say you're not equipped to then create a compassionate therapist if the person is not compassionate to start with. You know, I don't recommend you do that. I recommend you then let that person find another job and you get somebody who at least is equipped with the basic foundation for what you need. You know, so that's what I mean. There's sort of degrees of orientation and training preparation, some of which you can work with, some of which I would say that's a real waste of your energy to actually try to work with that. And, you know, that would be an HR conversation at that point. In the supervisory relationship itself. I'm sorry, let me do a pause here. Do we have questions that have come in? Carol, have any come in that I need to address?
No, you're good. All good.
Okay.
Everyone's just very happy, that's all.
I hope so. All right. So in the supervisory relationship, you know, sure, absolutely, breaches can happen, miscues can happen, we can have problems there, but let's just make sure we have a frame for what are we shooting for in a supervisory relationship that is quality. So depending on your clientele, depending on your context, there's going to be different things that are needed, different knowledge bases, different skills that are emphasized, but in general, the values that are needed. I think we can speak very generally and be very accurate with this. Superordinate values of applied practice. If you're doing this work, particularly in a trauma context, you need to be able to establish as a supervisor an integrity in relationship with your supervisee. That means a supervisory alliance that allows you to do good clinical supervision. They have to be safe enough, or they have to feel safe enough where they can then voice, here's my learning edge, here's where I feel like I'm not quite understanding. You know, they can put that on the table and engage you in that process. Now, you're not going to become their therapist. I'm not talking about that. I am talking about keeping it within the context of the supervision, you know, role. And so what goes into that? Well, things are very concrete that set the bounds for why a supervisee can experience safety and then be open in that way. That involves things like, is there a understood supervisory contract? Do we understand the structure of this thing? And is it on paper where we can both sit down, go over it and agree to it? And then do we stick to it? Do I keep the supervision time? Do I start on time? Do I not let things interrupt the supervision hour unnecessarily? When the phone rings, do I interrupt the supervision in order to pick the phone up as a supervisor? These are things that are going towards the frame. And if you set a good frame that is giving real clear indication for your supervisee whether or not this is sacred space where they can truly let the guard down and then talk about those learning edges and engage around those processes. If there's no frame, then it's not a safe, sacred space in that way. It takes a lot for a supervisor then to be able to do that. You know, if you want to set the groundwork for that. So, you know, a frame issues, being able to figure out how you stay in that lane of the good supervisor, all these things come into play there to make that supervisory alliance that creates what we need. Appreciation of diversity. We absolutely want to make sure that we're reinforcing the importance of the experience of the other. That other can be the therapist, that other can be the, if you're the supervisor, that other can be the client. Being able to align, come alongside, understand that experience. We value that as a profession, obviously. We value that as human beings, and that is absolutely needed and necessary. And this is why I say, when you've got the issues that come up around gender, around race, between supervisee and supervisor, it's not the stuff that's going to happen that's going to get somebody fired. Nobody's going to call you a racial slur. Or if they do, that's a whole different ball game there. But typically, you're going to have these subtle interactions that just say the person's not open to you for some reason. You're going to feel those things in the context of the relationship. But when there's greater inclusion, a greater respect for diversity, a greater awareness of those dynamics, then the supervisor and the supervisee have something to engage. Because you know what? Everybody does have their blind spots. You know, I have mine. I definitely have mine. I was, a little aside, I was sent down to Honduras. I worked in Honduras for 6 years. And I was working, part of it was work with women around gender-based violence. And I'm like the person who's like the point person, like the trainer. I needed to take a seat because these women were like, not, 16, 17-year-old girls, they were established women who have navigated this context of what it means to be a woman in authority position in a society that, when I use the word machismo, that's an understatement sometimes in some of these contexts, where they taught me way more than I could ever teach. I just had convening power. Hey, let's bring us all together and let's talk. And then they took it, so that's where we all have our blind spots. I have mine. And we have to just know that, hey, we got to be open to it to be able to engage this well. Ethical values-based practice. Hey, we are definitely trying to take the best of what we learn from science and apply it in evidence-based, but ultimately how we view people, the selection of what we sort of do in terms of our orientations, it's guided by our values. And sometimes the values between supervisor and supervisee don't necessarily mesh. We're not looking for meshing. We're looking for, can you then be in touch with your values, surface those, particularly when you might have value differences, be able to talk through things constructively. You want to model that. And so that's what we mean by that. And then science-informed practice, yes, how do you take this art of therapy and apply the best techniques that we are learning from the research? How do we actually integrate those things to make sure that we're getting good client outcomes? So this is what, the values, which also means, how do you make sure that you have training in your clinic? And how do you make sure that people have the bandwidth to apply the training and there's accountability behind the application of that training? Because if there's not, they're just going to do the same thing, even though you send them to the training. They're going to do the same thing behind the closed door with the client. So this is all going into what needs to happen. And it's reinforced by the supervision process in some real key ways. So that when you have the violations, then you know what you're violating against. You have a frame for understanding that a bit better. So violations in the relational integrity are typically going to be the things that violate the frame. Supervisor running late, therapist running late, ending early, all of those things. Violations of the appreciation of diversity, I've explained that. The things that can come up around gender, the things that can come around race, and any sort of able-bodiedness or what have you. Conflicts in the alliance or ruptures related to the values that are shaping the supervisor and supervisee. Not being able to talk about these things in ways where you can have supervisees who just choose and decide, but I'm going to do this instead, even though the supervisor is telling me to do this. I always say, how do you get there where the supervisee is just determining to do something that the supervisor is saying not to do? I know how to get there, which I will talk about in a moment. And then violations of science-informed, evidence-based practices. That you're just doing some things based on you think you know best, supervisee, but all indications are you need to be doing this other thing. But the problem is they're still going to go down that road. So we'll apply the same thing to supervisors, possible VT and supervisors. You're gonna, wow, that's so weird way that that's coming up. Anyway, boundary violations, violating the frame. And for supervisors, I'm gonna add one thing. When it says violating confidentiality, yeah, you understand that in terms of clients, but we have to understand that in terms of our supervisees. If we get with our supervisee and we start to talk about another supervisee in front with a particular other supervisee, that is a no. That is telling the supervisee, then that means you're going to talk about me behind my back with some other supervisee as well. And that just ruins what that person's going to be able to be open about. So violating confidentiality, even though there's not a confidentiality clause that you may sign in the same way with a client, but it absolutely is necessary, implied, and it needs to be upheld within the supervisory relationship. Inappropriate self-disclosure is one that I would say, hey, that can be tricky. There are some things that are wise self-disclosures, but depending on your particular supervisee, in order to help them grow and move along or gain some confidence, which you may not disclose to other supervisees who might just be very different. So I use an example from my own time as a supervisee, where I just, honestly, I made a faux pas that if I were my supervisor, I would have fired me. At least when I first started supervising, I would have fired me. Not now, I would have listened a little bit more. But I back in the day in the 90s, when psychologists did not leave the office, I left the office with a client because the client wanted to show me something. And I think he was going to show me something in the waiting room. And when I got to the waiting room, he said, no, it's outside. So then we went out of the doors. And then he said, no, it's actually downstairs. Anyway, he got me in his car. And then he took me out of the city that I was in to a different part of LA. And it took me to his house, never telling me what he wanted to show me. Anyway, that's the setup for me being fired if I were my own supervisor at that point. Because I'm thinking, how am I going to explain this? He showed me his artwork because he was a sculptor. His art pieces were too big to bring into the clinic. I've been working with him for a year to get him through he is recovering from drug addiction. He had been doing well, and he had produced these works that he wanted to show me as a result of his therapeutic process. He didn't tell me any of that up front. It was a gift. But I'm like, man, I'm going to get fired for this gift. But my supervisor was so gracious to understand it as the gift, but still warn me, hey, you got to figure out a different way of navigating this next time. And I use that to say, I would tell that story to a supervisee of mine who is a little tightly wound. Hey, you know what? Loosen up. Sometimes we make some missteps, and you know what? We can still work to figure out how it fits into the therapeutic frame. I might actually share a story like that of my own misstep, but I would never share that story with a supervisee who habitually crosses the lines and makes missteps, because that's gasoline to their fire, and so that's what I mean. Inappropriate self-disclosure is going to really be dependent on who the person is and kind of what the context is. Okay? VT in your organizations. And so here, if I can sort of sum up, here's the water that is actually the water that your therapists are swimming in every day. Their clients are dealing with trauma. And the trauma dynamic typically is the client knows what it's like to be the victim or the survivor of something horrible. They know what it's like to be on the receiving end of somebody who's perpetrating something horrible. And they know that there are bystanders, people who know what's going on, but they don't help or they can't help. That can be siblings who know that the client is being abused, but the sibling's powerless to stop that parent. It could be neighbors who know that the family is just, strange and they never intervene. They see and navigate relationship based on these lenses because that is a huge part of their experience, which means they bring this lens and can overlay this lens on their relationship with the therapist. So the therapist, the clinician, comes along and joins this connection with this client. And the client, let's say they're a kid, they like the therapist, it's all good, but the therapist cannot do things like stay with the client all day, every day, come to the client's school, come to the client's events. They've got to set boundaries and they got work to do. So when they set those boundaries, the client can experience that as, wow, that's painful. The person maybe doesn't want to be here, they're leaving, or I've got abandonment issues, and those can be triggered. Well, the client has a lens for understanding people who cause me pain, and that's the perpetrator lens. And then they overlay that lens. That's a projection. They project that. The therapist can feel, wow, I've really let this person down. I've hurt this person. And they can feel that very powerfully. And unless they do the work of remembering that these are projections based on a trauma dynamic, which is pulling the clinician into the trauma experience of the client, and the clinician's job is then to understand that experience, but then remember that they're the clinician, which is not the same as the perpetrator. The clinician then has to then deal with that differently. They have to remember that role that they have. If they don't, or if they don't have a lens for understanding that, they just experience themselves in that perpetrator role, which is a negative, that they figure out down the road after these experiences each and every day, how do I go into a therapeutic relationship where the kid doesn't get so close and dependent on me that I have to hurt them and set boundaries and feel this stuff. So then they're doing therapy at arm's length, which is going to result in worse client outcomes. That's not therapy. And so this is what they're navigating. And then they come into supervision with you, and they can apply this same lens that they've been given by the client over time. So now you as a supervisor say, hey, you got to go in this direction with the therapy. But they're like, but I don't have the bandwidth to do that, or I don't want to do that. And then they look at you as perpetrator. You're causing problems. And then you as a supervisor feel this certain kind of way in the therapeutic in the supervisory relationship. And you've got to have this frame for understanding that what's being projected is either a perpetrator, bystander, victim sort of a lens that's really coming from the client work. Because the clinician can feel like you are the perpetrator, which makes the clinician the bystander, the person who wants to help the client in a certain way, but they can't because their hands are tied. Now they're feeling impotent like the bystander, and the victim is the client. The whole thing now is just playing out in the supervisory relationship. And that can ruin the supervisory relationship, which is why then therapists can secretly select to do things in the room with the client that the supervisor is saying don't do, because they feel a certain kind of way about the information they're getting from the supervisor because they're using this frame. And so that is just the water. That is the water of trauma dynamics every day, each and every day, several times a day, because the clients have been traumatized. And this is the lens that they can inadvertently apply to the relationship, which then the therapist can inadvertently apply to their supervisory relationship, which can be inadvertently applied to the larger dynamics within the organization that the supervisor can then therefore bring, because you have bosses as well, and this can be overlaid there. So this is how organizations suffer. What do we do with it then? So in our last 30 minutes here together, we're going to transform all of this stuff, knowing that it exists, knowing that we have a frame and a lens to look at it, and maybe even a frame and lens to look at ourselves in terms of when we get into that zone 3 so we can take action. But ultimately, it really is, you've got to actually do life and do work in such a way where you are moving towards resilience and cultivation of the capacities to handle these things and handle them well. It's not what you do in the moment. It's how you live your life. It's how you do the work. And if you make it as part of your routine around certain factors, then that is what results in you staying in zone 2 and actually getting better over time in terms of being able to help people in crisis and with trauma dynamics. And then, we've heard of, so I'm going to say things like, yeah, take care of yourself, exercise. That's going to be all there with this. There are 17 factors that when we look at people who thrive over the course of a career as a therapist versus people who burn out, these people are doing 17 things that these people are not, that the burnout folks are not. There's 17 factors. I'm not going to give you 17, but I am going to give you 3 or 4 that are really generalizable. But yet and still, when it comes to the supervisor role, there's some real opportunities that you have, which is beyond telling your therapist to exercise, telling your therapist to, do work-life balance. It's how you actually engage the work, the therapeutic relationship, how you engage it. You cannot avoid trauma dynamics, but the difference between whether you have VT, vicarious trauma, come up in a negative way, or whether you move towards development of how do you stay more effective and develop your effectiveness, is just how you handle it. You can't avoid the current in the ocean. It's how you actually navigate the current that is going to make the difference. And the CSERT model, which is what you see there, involves how do you actually help a therapist engage the therapeutic process itself in such a way that therapy is not draining, so that they've got to then take care of themselves outside of therapy in order to recover. But therapy itself is managed in such a way that it's not a drain, that you actually develop as a result of it. Doesn't mean that it's not difficult and that the emotions aren't painful, but it's not harmful in the way that you navigate it so that you grow. So that's what that second piece is, and we'll get to that. The idea for resilience, though, it's kind of captured in this picture. It's like, can you work in contexts that are really demanding, but you've got the ability to sort of withstand the negative impact? Nobody's impervious to negative impact. There's always some situation that can knock anybody backwards, put you in zone 4. But can you bounce back quickly when you do get knocked back? can you bounce back quickly? That means you're living your life and doing the work in such a way where you can. And so that's the idea of resilience. It breaks down into typically 3 categories. I'm going to give you 4. There is a physical self-care component to people who are doing well and thriving. They are taking care of themselves physically. You cannot function outside of your body, so you have to take care of your body. So physical self-care. Here's the thing. When I say we can get people out of zone 4 and out of zone 3 into zone 2, the quickest way that we can do that is to get them to engage a physical self-care regimen that looks a certain way. Because if you remember, the reason that you're in zone 3 and those symptoms are there is because you have brain changes. We know how to actually change the body chemistry so that the connections that have been severed in that part of the brain actually repair themselves. That's the only part of the brain that can repair themselves, but you have to set the body conditions in order to do that. And you can do that through physical self-care, exercise. If the cortisol is elevated causing the damage, you must get the cortisol down. Cortisol is there to mobilize your body to run or fight. So then engage a physical exercise regimen that mimics running and fighting. Cardiovascular workouts, you're using your arms and your legs. That lowers the cortisol. If you engage an exercise regimen, though, that is cardio, that lasts for 20 minutes at a time in duration, and get your heart rate up so that you get some sweat being produced, your body produces a protein, BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that then becomes the repair substance that causes the connections in the brain cells to grow back. That is how you do that. It takes about 6 weeks minimum of actually engaging that workout in order to see those connections come back in significant enough number where we start to see those symptoms disappear. It takes about 6 weeks, but it is really, really predictable that it happens. And so 4 or 5 days a week of a workout that's 20 minutes in duration, if you make that a part of your routine and your habit, you can reverse those symptoms and get out of zone 4, out of zone 3, into zone 2, where you have no symptoms that are showing up. Even though you're in a context that has taken nothing off of your plate, you still have the same demands. You're now processing in such an efficient way, just physiologically, that your brain is now able to work with you to deal with those issues. So that's the quickest way, and maybe even the easiest way to do it. It's not easy, okay, but it is sort of only dependent on you. You can do it. You can do self-care. You don't even have to go out and run a marathon. You can just get a 7-minute workout app and do it in your own room if you just have a room. Just run through it 3 times. Just be diligent about it and make it a part of your process. Social support. If you want to know the best way, honestly, to develop that cushion and stay in zone 2 and live to be 100, it is your social support. It is how you connect with other people. Typically, it's looking like 2 things. And so there's plenty of research that says you've got to have good working relationships. And when that is there, hey, that is so helpful. Meaning, people who know what it's like to do what it is that you do. That doesn't mean work relationships with a therapist who you're responsible for. You've got responsibilities there. I'm talking about reciprocal work relationships, people who you don't have to be responsible for, who understand what it is to do what you do. So other supervisors who you're not having to supervise, other people who are at your level. If you've got good people who understand what that is like, and you stay connected, meaning you may not all work together, but if you could pick the phone up and say, hey, here's what's going on, or vice versa. If you've ever had the experience of people sort of talking about, the day or the situation or the circumstance in such a way that it crystallizes your own experience of the situation or circumstance, and you haven't really kind of put it together that way, but hearing them talk about it says, oh yeah, I get it. That's exactly what's going on with me. That's worth gold. That's like you doing the process, but somebody else is doing the work and making it happen for you. And that's what you want. You want those folks who understand that role that you have, and you stay in connection with them. That's what you get from them. But you must have people who don't understand your role, who don't do what it is that you do, that you stay in connection with as well. You have to have a channel change. Your brain should not be on work mode indefinitely. Work mode, even when you've got good relationships with other supervisors, and you're talking about things not necessarily work related, just shooting the breeze, you're still on work channel, because that's what the association is in the brain. You've got to have friends and family, people outside of the work context that allow your brain to get off of work channel mode, because that's what the brain needs. It's got to change the channel every now and then. That's how it really does a lot of its good recharge. So, you know, for this one, I use the example of my wife, and I'm going to throw myself under the bus on this one to illustrate a point. So my wife is a therapist. She's a psychologist. She works with kids. At the end of a tough day for her, which is never kids acting the way that kids act, because that's the way kids are. The tough day for her is the parents of the kids don't act right or don't realize that they're causing their kids stress, and it's hard to get through to them. That's a tough day. She'll come home and she'll have one of those days. Here's these dynamics that keep coming up, and she's now just sort of processing through her day. Not telling me her clients, because I don't know these folks, but just processing through her day, like a spouse or partner might do. Now, me personally, I don't like to process through my day, and I don't really like to process through her day. That's not how I function, but I'm going to be a good partner. And so I'm going to listen, is what I say to myself in my head. But what happens is I got this consultant hat that I throw on too often. And so as she's processing her day with me and just telling me some stuff, I start to then weigh in ways that are not helpful. So I start to say things like, hey, well, have you thought about X, Y, Z? Or maybe if you do this instead. And now I'm off to the races in my head, fixing her problem, and she's getting upset. And I don't ever sort of register, hey, maybe I should stop talking. I just try to make my point to make sure that she's hearing where I'm coming from. And here's what she'll do. She'll stop the conversation. She will be upset, but she will go and she will get on the phone with her best friend, who she's known since middle school. And they both moved out here from Chicago, so they grew up in a whole different context. And she will have a conversation with her best friend that has nothing to do with work. And they pick up in the middle of a conversation that they started 30 years ago, in the middle of something. And I'm lost. I'm like, you didn't introduce a topic. You guys just jumped in, started talking. They talk at the same time. I don't know how they understand each other. They switch topics. They never introduce the topic. They've got this vibe between them that I can't follow. But here's the thing. My wife gets off of that call, and she looks 20 years younger. She looks refreshed. She is no longer frustrated spouse. She's no longer frustrated therapist, because she has been in the mode of best friend for about 10, 20 minutes on a phone conversation. That's how powerful that channel change is. And so if you've got people in your life who know you so well that they can reach in and pull you out of therapist mode, out of supervisor mode, and you become best friend again, or you become niece or daughter or son, that's a channel change that is worth gold. You need that. And so don't forsake those things. That is truly what I see as the most bang for the buck in terms of moving towards resilience. So if you got it, hold on to it and intentionally engage it. The self-efficacy, that is really how you do the job. And typically I can boil it down into two things. You must be competent in your supervisory capacity, and you must have confidence in your supervisory capacity. Competence, having the knowledge and the skills. You must then have the confidence that then comes from the experience of knowing that you're helping to affect clients positively through the supervisees and helping those supervisees develop. When you see that you're able to do that well, then you develop confidence, so that when you enter into COVID-19 mode, where now you've got to change your entire structure, what these crisis contexts do is they pull your attention to the stuff out there that you cannot control. Okay, this looming problem. If you stay focused on what is out of your control, that is a loss of sense of agency that registers in the brain. Like I said earlier, that's a burnout factor. You must shift your focus to what is within your control. Well, if you've got skills and knowledge as a good supervisor and you know that you got those things, that's where you shift to. So what do I do to bring the best of what I know to this crazy context now? That shift is the key. That is the key, okay? It is a subtle shift, but unless you have confidence in your capacity, you cannot make it. And then you stay focused on what's out of your control if you don't do that shift, which only amplifies the amygdala response, and then that amygdala drives the ship with emotional reactivity. And so you want to stay in that mode where you stay focused and sort of anchored in your capacity, but you need the confidence to do that. So self-efficacy is about how do you set a course where you develop capacity, or competence. So this is where I would say sort of Any approach that lets you know as a developing clinician, developing supervisor, that you're making the gains according to what are the benchmarks that we see that are appropriate for this role that you have. When you see that you're able to do that and you make those gains because there's feedback in it, then you can develop your confidence around that. And that's really helpful for these moments because this is what you have to rely on in this process. And when you're in these moments, just know that, hey, you're still in your learning edge. And so how do you continue to go forward and develop that? But you've got some things in place. Maybe you've got a system where, all right, when I tip into zone 3, I might make some errors. So maybe I have a second set of eyes that can sort of look over my process and my work before I turn it in or before I submit it. Those are really good structures. Yeah, minimize and mitigate the errors that are likely to come up because you're in a COVID-19 emergency context where errors are likely to be there because you're just beyond your capacity. So these are the systems that allow you to then still do good work, even in the midst of difficulty, and not erode your confidence in your competence because you're now seeing bad outcomes because you don't have these things in place and you're just seeing that you're not able to accomplish what you're able to accomplish. So that's self-efficacy. And finally, meaning and purpose. The worst situations, the worst trauma situations, it's helpful to have meaning and purpose frames, larger frames by which you try to grapple with what does this mean? And it doesn't mean that you find things that explain it away. You know, there are horrible things out there that no frame can truly explain, all right? But you're trying to grapple with it. Your supervisees are trying to grapple with it. If you come into this work with the frame, the larger meaning and purpose frame, whether it be religious, whether it be naturalistic, whatever that frame is, if the frame is something like, people get what they have coming to them. If you work hard, you reap good benefits. If you don't work hard, you reap bad benefits. If that is your frame, and then you work with kids who are innocent and get abused in the most horrendous ways, it's going to shatter that frame. Because in reality, horrible things come to people who don't deserve it. In reality, horrible things like oppressive dynamics happen to communities, and those communities have not brought it upon themselves. And it's going to challenge those frames. And sometimes people are just very adept at maintaining those frames and just, you know, accusing the very communities that they're there to help of not helping themselves. You know, that happens. But growth means that you're going to challenge and stretch and tear down some of those frames and get better ones as you do this work. It's the process that you have to just stay involved with. If you stay involved with a process that is allowing you to grapple with these realities of the horrors that you're seeing in trauma dynamics in a way that you're trying to make sense of it. How does this fit in the big grand scheme of life? What does God have in place, in store for me? Whatever that is for you, you engage that process. It is counteracting a trauma dynamic. Trauma dynamics are trying to then overwhelm an individual so that the experience does not get framed. It does not fall into a narrative. They can't pull that in any sort of way where it fits and it makes sense. They can't assimilate anything. You can't see the forest for the trees. You're just being bombarded. You just want out. And so then you go towards avoidance tactics. How can I then not deal with this or keep it far away from me because I don't know what to do with it? Well, you're engaging it. You're trying to see how it interacts with larger frames. What is a more appropriate frame? That process, that's counteracting a trauma dynamic. You're trying to engage. So you may not wrap it up with a bow and explain all the horrors away, but you're engaged in a process that's going to lead towards betterment as opposed towards the worst. Here's an exercise that I lead with you that says, hey, take those 4 elements that I've just talked through with you: physical self-care, social support, self-efficacy, meaning and purpose. Figure out the patterns that you need to create in your life. Figure out the patterns that need to be there for the supervisees and the trainees and the therapists that you supervise. Help them or encourage them to develop what does physical self-care need to look like for you. That's part of your routine. Your social support. Identify the good people in your world because you want to stay connected to those, and identify the people who bring you stress because you want a boundary against those, particularly when you're going through times of high stress. So knowing what modes you shift into with each of these during a period like COVID-19 is actually really helpful. And then on the other side of COVID-19, how do you re-engage, or what do you expect from yourself when you come out of this season? Because if what you expect is you're going to just bounce back and do the same amount of work output that you always were accustomed to, not realizing that you go into a natural recovery period and you'll accomplish less for a little season before you bounce back all the way, then you only set yourself up for failure and you interpret that as failure. You know, you got to have these sort of broad brush understandings of how we actually navigate through periods and seasons of high stress and emergency. And then what do these factors look like in each so that we just do it well. Finally, and this is the last content slide, which, you know, this one slide is worth a workshop all of its own. There's a such thing as self-care fatigue, which is to say, how we've talked about self-care too long is, hey, the work itself, the therapeutic process is draining. Therefore, when you disengage and you're done with the workday, go do something that allows you to recharge. The idea is that the work is draining, therefore go take care of yourself outside of work. Missing the fact that the problem a lot of times is that the work is draining not because the work itself is draining, it's because the work doesn't try to help people with self-care. They're just dumping work on them. You know, there's processes that are responsible for that. And, you know, and what the therapist hears is, hey, take care of yourself, but here's a ton of work. You know, and so the therapist is then saddled with self-care on top of a ton of work, you know, and so when they don't engage in self-care, we're looking at them and saying, why didn't you take care of yourself? That's self-care burden. And this approach is saying, no, there's a way to actually engage the work and be with one another that allows you to go through the challenges of this work in a way that's not harmful or depleting. In a way that's not harmful or depleting. Experiential engagement is just an idea that, number one, understanding that the work itself is not harmful or depleting. The work can be tough, it can be painful, but what you have to learn in the process is when you hear trauma dynamics which are painful, you are going to experience those emotions as well. Your job is to experience those emotions, because what you'll learn is emotions hit, they rise, and then they recede. That is what you have to then develop a real confidence in. Emotions have a very predictable pattern. They hit, they intensify, and then they recede. A trauma dynamic says emotions hit, they intensify, and they never go away. So you've got to come up with some way to avoid that stuff. And you never give the emotions a chance to recede. So you never have this awareness as the traumatized person that this horrible stuff is actually going to lessen over time. Therefore, they just try to avoid it, and they never get that part of the experience. So you as the therapist have to model that. But you as the therapist or the supervisor, you have to know that. You have to develop that confidence. You will experience this stuff, it will intensify, but it always recedes. The problem is we have a brain that'll play it back indefinitely. It will ruminate on horrible things. So we then have to say, how do we reduce rumination? Because we're giving a message to our trainees that, hey, leave work at home, but that's a skill. That's not something that's intuitive. You have to teach folks how to do that in our world. And so how do you kick your brain out of a rumination process? By engaging things in such a way where you engage the circuitry that doesn't promote rumination. And this is, you know, like I said, it's worth a workshop of its own. So this is where I might lose some of you a bit. And if so, shoot me emails, I can clarify. But figuring out how you can engage your brain in a process where you're dealing with action-oriented thoughts, specific thoughts, thoughts that are concrete, thoughts that really are specific and referential to your experience, that's a different brain circuitry. And we give it the acronym ACEs, ACES, which you know that's also the acronym for childhood trauma. Okay? So I think there's a reason that they gave it that acronym, but it offsets the rumination process and offsets the trauma process. And so there's a way that we can sort of model, but also teach that as well. Then conscious narrative is just basically making sure that our therapists have an understanding of their role going into this work, that they bring a certain skill set. They are trauma stewards. They have skills that can manage trauma that maybe not everybody else in the community has. They've got a certain skill set and a certain role, but they're learning. And so while they're in the work, just know that, hey, when you get to your learning edge, you have to interpret that as growth opportunities, engage that properly, but not interpret it as failure. And it's going to be difficult in that moment because they're driven by their own drive and internal standards, and they've got to figure out how they navigate that. And then when they get out of those moments, the reflective supervision process, this is where it really encapsulates that narrative. What you consolidate from the experiences, that is what supervision is key for. How do you then reflect on things in such a way where you pull out the meaning and you distill what you need to from the experience? Repeat what ACEs stand for. A, action-oriented. C, concrete. E, experiential, related to the actual experiences that the therapist is having. And S, specific. So the thoughts are, instead of going into, wow, such a long day, let me go into sort of free-floating, default mode where then ruminations come up, is no, let me shift out of that by focusing on something. It's really more of a mindfulness. If you go into rumination mode, you can say, hey, I'm ruminating again, and there it is. And even doing that gets you focused on something that's action-oriented and concrete, and it can kick you out of rumination. If the stuff is really intense, though, you might actually need to be able to do this in more sophisticated ways, okay? Reducing emotional labor. You do want to, therapists have some unlearning to do sometimes. So yes, adverse childhood experiences is a meaning in another context. Good point. But they use the same acronyms. And this is why I say it's a little confusing that they use the same acronym, but they're meaning to counteract the trauma dynamic, which is why they selected this acronym. So that's why I wish I probably should have not even said the acronym at this point, should have just explained it. But it's really helpful just to remember, I think. So therapists have some unlearning to do because they learn things along the way, like, hey, unconditional positive regard is the way to go. Not realizing that you might actually hear some things in the course of therapy with people that are like, that's horrendous. And maybe they're like the perpetrators. And when that stuff happens, you're going to feel internally some revulsion, some things that it's going to strike you as adverse. How do you then maintain connection if you're driven by unconditional positive regard, but you're feeling something very differently inside? That's what we talk about as emotional labor. The difference between your expressed emotion and your experienced emotion. When there's a big gap there, that is what is harmful. That's the harm. Now, we're not trying to mesh that, saying that you must love perpetrators in order to, and truly come from that place. It is to say, how can you close that gap so that it's not as big of a gap? Because you're seeing client after client after client over years. Closing that gap means, hey, when the aversive stuff comes up in response to a client, how can I adopt the position of being curious about what might this represent? Is it an adaptation in response to this person's trauma that I'm experiencing? Being curious about it then maybe allows you to maybe move in a little bit closer. Yeah, you still hold, if it's a problem behavior, whatever, especially if it's victimizing other people, you still hold that person accountable for that. But, is it coming from a place where you now have an abuser who was once abused? And now you remember, okay, there's a child in here who knows what it's like to have been abused, and they're enacting this thing, which, let me just say, in one of my other presentations, a very important point I skipped. Not all abusers were abused themselves, okay? But it causes you to be curious so that you can move into a position where you can maybe close the gap a bit and not experience such a gap between what you're expressing and what you're experiencing. Ultimately, you may have situations where you might have to just surface it. Hey, you know what? I'm feeling a bit of a disconnect here. I'm wondering if we can maybe talk about what ways to maybe break through this. There's skillful ways to surface that so that you can reduce that experience. And that is definitely something that you have to learn. Parasympathetic recovery, the last one. Over the course of the work day, we're encouraged to engage in things like mindfulness techniques throughout the course of the day. Through a webinar, if you have stayed seated this entire time, I would hope that you then get in the back of your mind, you don't have to stay seated. It's a webinar. I can't see you. You can get up and you can stretch. You can be doing deep knee bends. You can be paying attention, but you can be moving in ways that are just good for you. You want to figure out how you do stuff like that, how you integrate it into your day. How do you get out of activation mode from when these emotions get kicked up because of what you're hearing in the work, so that you can ground yourself in the midst of it and make sure that you cannot go into a rumination mode on the other side of it? There are a lot of techniques for it that have real implication. Take your vacation, do things like that. But how you take your vacation? Vacation is good for 3 weeks. You bounce back and you're good for 3 weeks from a vacation, 3 weeks only. So that means, do you save up and take a real big vacation, or do you take mini vacations along the way throughout the year and space them out? If you're doing trauma work, the mini vacations are actually the most bang for the buck, because then you get 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks with each mini vacation, as opposed to 3 weeks with some big vacation. 3 weeks is just the good space that you're in until you're back to whatever the old way you were before you went on vacation. So think about these things in some creative ways. This is absolutely worth going to a workshop on for supervisors and for therapists, especially if you're working within the trauma dynamic. So the final goal, and this is my last slide, if we can do these things, we're not avoiding the reality of trauma dynamics and how it sort of is in the environment. That's just it comes along with the territory. It's the water in which we swim. But how do we engage that water in such a way where we move it towards transformation or an increased capacity to do this work over time and help more people? It's all going to depend on how we handle that therapeutic process, how we're taking care of ourselves in terms of our routines. And when we have what we need in place as a part of how we do the job, how we do life, then we will find that the adversity that we experience like now is a part of the equation that leads towards that cultivation of great things. We never find resilience in people who have not gone through adversity. It is a part of what's needing to be there. So I'm going to assume it's there because we're in this context and it's the nature of your work. Do you have what you need to transform it in the right way so that it doesn't take you towards burnout? That's what this is all about. So with that, I am done with a minute left.
You are.
So,
one quick question. Could you tell the group again what ACEs is in your framework?
Sure. So ACEs in this framework stands for thoughts that are A, action-oriented, thoughts that are C, concrete, not amorphous, concrete, E, thoughts that are experiential, related to your actual experience in the work, S, thoughts that are specific. Action-oriented, concrete, experiential, specific. And there's a circuitry in the brain dedicated to these types of thoughts that counteract rumination. And so that's a really good framework.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Williamson. We are so appreciative for all your work. Truly wonderful. And I think wonderful, glowing comments on the comments. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. You're doing tremendous work out there. You don't have to get on a plane and go to Afghanistan, the places where I work. You just get in the car and go right up the street, and so that's a whole different reality there. That's actually probably brings its own challenges.